and welcome to English for You. That's Vampire Mike.
Hi.
And I'm Vampire Reese. And we've just sucked some blood.
We did?
No, we didn't do that.
We didn't do that.
No, that was
Plus,
the
I didn't
guy.
get my blood. You're keeping all the blood for yourself.
We've been to the blood bank and we're talking about vampires again because yesterday we learned that vampires probably aren't real.
That's true.
They probably come from stories about people who had a health condition.
That's right, a strange health condition that people might still have today, but of course today doctors and scientists can explain it. They even have a name for it, porphyria. But if you look at the symptoms, which people could have had hundreds of years ago before doctors knew what was going on, those symptoms included sharp teeth, pale skin, being very sensitive to the sun, and things like that. And those are all things that vampires have or do, right? So a long time ago, people didn't know the science. They just knew something weird about that person. He must be a monster.
Yeah, well, nowadays we know better. We know that vampires probably don't really exist, and actually these people were sick and kind of needed our help.
Right.
Luckily for us, medicine has come a long way and we now understand how to help people with these kinds of conditions instead of calling them monsters and maybe even burning them or killing them.
Oh my God, no, that's not nice.
That's not nice. Anyway, the world of vampires has come a long way in the last few hundred years. There are thousands of stories about them in books and film and TV. And in today's article, we're going to learn about some of the most famous ones.
Reading.
A Bloody History of Vampires. The most famous vampire is Count Dracula, which was created by Irish author Bram Stoker. However, Stoker's character was not the first vampire to be written about. In 1819, English writer John Polidori wrote a short story, The Vampire. Since then, there have been countless stories about creatures that drink blood. Some vampires have been inspired by real people from history. Dracula was loosely based on Vlad the Impaler, a leader from 15th century Europe. Stoker heard scary rumors about Vlad, though many others thought he was a hero. There are some differences between vampires in different stories, but most descriptions have common features. Vampires don't like garlic and can be killed by wooden crosses. They have no reflections, and some can turn into bats. More recently, movies and TV shows like Twilight and True Blood have changed the way people think about vampires. Modern vampires have become sexy villains instead of just evil monsters. Even though vampires aren't real, stories about them continue to frighten and entertain people all around the world.
All right, so let's find out about the vampires that we know from stories. Of course, these aren't from history because we know that it's not a real thing, but it's still scary and it's still made for some great monster stories. So let's look at some of the most famous and oldest vampire stories. It says the most famous vampire is Count Dracula, which was created by Irish author Bram Stoker. I think he wrote these books around 140, 50 years ago, something like that. And a lot of the things we know about vampires come from this book, Count Dracula. I would definitely recommend reading it. However, Stoker's character was not the first vampire to be written about. I was surprised by that because I really thought he got most of the credit for inventing the vampire as we know it today, but someone beat him to it by a few years.
They did, and that person was an English writer. In 1819, English writer John Polidori wrote a short story, The Vampire, but spelled with a Y instead of an I.
Right.
Since then, there have been countless stories about creatures that drink blood. Yeah, Count Dracula's the most famous one, and he's the one we think of, wearing a black cape with big collar.
Turning into a bat.
Yeah, sleeping
like
inside of a coffin.
Right, yeah.
And,
crucifix, using the cross to stop him.
I think a lot of those tropes come from Count Dracula, but he was not the first.
Interesting.
We saw the word countless here, which basically means too many to count. But what's more interesting is that it ends with the letters L-E-S-S. These 4 letters are magical and they can change many words into different meanings. It's a suffix, and the suffix less usually means without this thing. So, for example, if you want to say that a situation is without hope, you could say it was hopeless. If you don't need something, you could say it was needless. If you're beyond help, you're helpless. And if there is no end, then it's endless.
And if a vampire bites you, it will be painless.
Oh.
You won't feel it.
Well, we saw the word creature here as well. We touched on this yesterday when we talked about monsters. But let's take a closer look at what this creepy word means. So a creature is an imaginary living thing that is strange or frightening. Or it can be a living thing that we haven't identified. So it kind of has 2 uses in that way. Creature is a general word for a monster or an animal that we don't really know about. Technically, humans are a kind of creature, though we wouldn't really say that. We usually use this word to talk about monsters in stories, but we can also use it to talk more generally about animals. For example, you could say there are many creatures living in the forests of Taiwan. Now here, the word creatures doesn't have a scary connotation to it. It just means there are different kinds of animals living there. Maybe we don't really know exactly which ones, but we know that there are creatures that reside in those trees. Here's an example sentence. Strange creatures live in the deepest parts of the world's oceans. Who knows what things swim around down there?
All right, so yes, vampires go back a long way, even before Bram Stoker's famous book, Vampire, V-A-M-P-Y-R. I think there was a video game called Vampire, V-A-M-P-Y-R, that also was about sort of being a vampire back then. Never played it, but hey, if you like vampires, maybe check that one out. Back to the article. Some vampires have been inspired by real people from history. Okay, these are not people I would want to meet. I won't take my time machine back to meet real people who inspired vampires. Let's meet one of these charming, wonderful people. Dracula was loosely based on Vlad the Impaler, a leader from 15th century Europe. He was a really cruel king who did horrible things to his enemies. But in some parts of Europe, he's still a hero because he helped to win big wars and, you know, protect people or whatever. But he did it in a very awful, cruel, terrible way. But of course, hearing these stories from history and in the history books, it might have inspired someone. People are often inspired when they're writing fiction, writing a movie or a book or a story. They might be inspired by something real that happened. When you're inspired by something, it gives you an idea for a new work, a new creative thing that you are doing. You might hear a few notes that a bird is singing, and if you're a musician, that might inspire a whole song. You'll take those notes and then stretch it out, change it around, but it's sort of like the seed where your great ideas come from. So if you're really interested in something from the past, you could write about it just by telling people like history, or you can use it to kind of create a story, but use that to inspire you. And if something is based on something, that is kind of like where the idea comes from. We've changed things, but this was the beginning of the idea. We were inspired by this. This was the seed that we then developed and grew and changed, but it was originally focused or originally taken from this real thing that happened in the past. And we also had the word loosely here. Something is loosely based on, basically we're saying, yeah, it did happen in the past, but we changed a lot of it. There's very little here that's really true. So if it's loosely based on something from the past, don't watch the movie and then take a history test, because you'll be way off because they changed a lot of stuff if it's loosely based on something. For example, this song is loosely based on a story my grandfather told me when I was young. So he told me an exciting story or a sad story. I took the basic idea, made a song, but I changed a lot of stuff.
There we are. Well, with a name like Vlad the Impaler, he sounds like a pretty terrible guy, and I guess we should explain the word impale. Impale means to stick something, usually a spear or a knife.
A big sharp stick.
Yeah, through somebody, to kill them. So Vlad the Impaler maybe had a habit of killing people this way.
Yeah, he did.
Oh. Anyway, back to the article, and it says Stoker, who's that author who wrote Dracula, Stoker heard scary rumors about Vlad, though many others thought he was a hero, as Mike explained. History is complicated, and so are the people in it. Vlad may have done terrible things to some people, but in other people's eyes, he was a liberator, and he helped them win fights that then maybe improved their lives.
That's right, exactly. There are some differences between vampires in different stories, but most descriptions have common features. Yeah, it's true. If you're a real student of the vampire stories, you might know that in some stories, for example, they talk about how a cross can stop the vampire, or garlic, the smell of garlic might make the vampire sick or run away. But then in other stories, they don't talk about those things. So sometimes it's kind of hard to know exactly what the facts are. But remember, this is all made up. You can kind of make vampires however you want. But some of the common things we find in stories really do kind of carry over between the books, the old movies, and the modern TV shows, like being afraid of sunlight.
Yeah, I guess that's good for the audience because there's some consistency here.
It's like the rules of the character. If suddenly vampires can fly and shoot lasers out of their eyes, people would say, whoa, that's not a vampire, that's something different.
Well, it didn't stop Twilight from adding to the lore, right? I think in Twilight the vampires can run at like 100 miles per hour.
And they do go out in the sun, but it's very cloudy all the time.
And then their skin kind of sparkles like diamonds.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So much I don't know.
That's why I didn't like that movie.
Okay.
One of the reasons. Anyway, back to the article and more about some of these tropes or things that people think about vampires from different stories. Vampires don't like garlic, unusual, and can be killed by wooden crosses. A cross is kind of like this shape.
Like in a Christian church.
Exactly, because vampires are evil creatures, and I guess the power of God can help to kill them. They have no reflections. And some can turn into bats.
Interesting. I remember that Dracula could turn into a bat, but he could also turn into like smoke or gas.
Right.
So he can get under your door by turning himself into fog or smoke. And I haven't seen that in a lot of other movies, but turning into bats, that one is common.
That is common.
Interesting.
Well, the article said using wooden crosses or wooden stakes can help you kill a vampire. Let's take a look at this word wooden. If you know the word wood, W-O-O-D, then wooden is a pretty easy word to learn in addition. If something is wooden, then it is made of wood. And wood, as we know, comes from trees. You could have a wooden chair, a chair made of wood, a wooden table, a wooden toy, or as the story mentioned, a wooden cross. A wooden cross is a cross made of wood that you could maybe sharpen at one end to stab into the heart of a vampire to kill them. The reason that it's wood is because in the stories from the Bible, Jesus was killed on a wooden cross. So if we're using the power of God or Jesus from Christian mythology to help us kill a vampire, then it needs to be a wooden cross. Here's an example sentence with wooden. Most of the furniture in my living room is wooden. I like the natural feeling of wood. So the article also mentioned that in some stories, vampires don't have a reflection. Your reflection is there when you look into a mirror, or very clear glass, or even clear water. You might see yourself looking back at you. No, it's not a second you, it's just your reflection. When the light hits something very smooth, like a mirror or some glass.
Or your cell phone.
Or your cell phone, yeah. Then the light bounces back at you into your eyes and you can see everything in the mirror that's being reflected.
Okay.
Unless you're a vampire.
Good point.
They have no reflections.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest clues as to a vampire being around. So we're going to do the old mirror test after we've finished filming, Mike.
Oh, that's a good idea. Or just generally, if you wake up in the morning and you go to comb your hair and you can't see yourself, go back to bed.
Yes.
Yeah, and wait till the night when your bloodlust will drive you to the streets. Anyways, more recently, it says movies and TV shows like Twilight and True Blood, oh yeah, have changed the way people think about vampires. Yeah, a lot of the things we've been reading before, those were from the older stories, the old movies, and a lot of the old movies kind of copied the stories. But recently they tried to make some more modern style vampire things like Twilight the movie and True Blood. I think that was an HBO TV show. And they did change a few things. They can run really fast. Of course, they lived in the modern world and things like that because, you know, people always like these stories. But if you make them a little more modern, a little more kind of set in our present time or set recently, people might be a little more interested. When we use this word recently, we mean around the time that we are living in, around our time now, in the last few days, months, years, something like that. For example, recently, you can't go anywhere without everyone having a cell phone or a smartphone in their hand. If you went back 10 years, maybe a few people might have had them now, had them then, but now everybody has one. So recently, having a cell phone is as common as carrying anything that else you might carry. For example, I recently found out that turtles and tortoises are different.
Yeah, one lives in the sea.
Yeah, and in water, and the other one doesn't. I only found that out last week. I was talking to a turtle, and I said, "Hey, you're a good-looking tortoise."
He was like, I'm sorry?
He got mad. I learned a lesson.
Yeah, vampires have changed over the years, and I seem to remember about 10 or 15 years ago, the vampire genre was kind of revived, right? There was a huge amount of media coming from TV and film.
Yeah.
There was another show, I think, called Vampire Diaries.
Okay.
And what was that film with Brad Pitt from
Interview with the Vampire,
Yeah, that's
the
a
Anne
great-
Rice books. Yeah, it's
great
true.
movie.
Vampires, and then more recently, zombies kind of came back too and became modern and, you know, popular again.
And they started to combine vampire stories with werewolf stories like they did in Twilight. And these groups of monsters are apparently mortal enemies. Anyway, the article says modern vampires have become sexy villains instead of just evil monsters. That's something that's changed a lot. Vampires used to be horrible, ugly creatures.
Yeah, maybe, or kind of, you know, very elegant gentlemen.
Yeah.
But not sexy, not the kind of guy you'd want to date in high school, Edward Cullen.
Well, sexy is a word that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to introduce you to this word. The word sexy is an adjective, and we usually use it to describe people. A person that is sexy is very attractive. That means they look really nice. We could describe them as beautiful or handsome. The word sexy is quite an adult word. We usually use it to describe people that we're sexually attracted to. That means people we want to get to know better on a physical, personal level. Here's an example sentence. My mum thinks the actor Tom Hardy is very sexy. She always posts pictures of him on Facebook. True story. So the article said that they are now sexy villains. The vampires have changed from being kind of ugly or maybe gentleman-like creatures to being sexy villains. A villain is a bad guy in a movie. The evil person in a story who the hero is trying to defeat. A villain does bad things and for bad reasons. And there are many villains in movies and stories, like Dr. Octavius in Spider-Man. Or, if you're a fan of SpongeBob SquarePants, Plankton, the tiny guy. He's the villain of the story because he's always trying to steal the Krabby Patty recipe. We also saw the phrase instead of, which is something that Mike explained yesterday. Instead of just means as an alternative or a substitute. It's basically just another option or another way of doing something or thinking about something.
All right, let's get back to the article. And it says, even though vampires aren't real, stories about them continue to frighten and entertain people all around the world. Yes, I think only the most major vampire fan will say, oh no, they're real. They absolutely are real. Most people know that they're not real, but most people still might be entertained by stories about these fictional, scary monsters. Part of the reason people like them, they frighten us. When we are frightened, we are scared, basically. If you frighten a person, you can use it as a verb. You jump out and scare the person or do something that makes them feel fear. And if you put an ed on it, of course, that is the feeling you have. I am frightened because you jumped out to frighten me. All right. For example, we could say, hey, don't jump out and scream like that. You really frightened me. Yes, we could also say you really scared me. And it's a strange thing about people, right? We pay to be frightened or to be scared. This is a way we entertain ourselves. When you entertain, basically you give someone joy, pleasure, amusement, probably by an action or an activity that they're doing or that they're watching. This is something you might do in your free time that gives you joy, happiness, pleasure. Or it might scare you, but that still gives you joy, happiness, and pleasure. So when we think of your hobbies, when we think of the things you do on the weekend, when you have some free time, why are you doing it? Because it's fun. You do it to entertain yourself. All right, that's all the time we have, but before we go away, there is a chat question. So let's come back and check that out.
For You Chat.
Today's For You Chat question is about vampires in stories and media. Mike, have you read any books about vampires? Have you seen any movies or TV shows about them? Talk about them.
Actually, I've probably read more books than I've seen movies or TV shows. I mean, I've read the old Bram Stoker Dracula book 3 or 4 times. It's a great book and it's very short. I mean, the English language might be a little old, but I think enough things in the story you would be familiar with from TVs and movies that I think almost anyone could read that book. And as I said, it's quite short.
Is it really scary?
I think for people today, maybe not. But it's certainly, and here I would use the word creepy.
Okay.
It's the kind of book you could read without having bad dreams, but you might turn on a few extra lights in your bedroom at night if you are reading it. And then the Interview with the Vampire, I read that, and Salem's Lot, which is by Stephen King. Now, Salem's Lot is like 600 pages,
book.
so maybe start with Bram Stoker if you're interested. And I think you probably have seen way more movies and TV shows than I have.
Yeah, but I think most of the TV shows and movies that I have seen about vampires were inspired by or based on the original books and stories.
Oh, okay. That's true, because Twilight was books before it was movies, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are so many movies about Dracula that were all based on Bram Stoker's original. And there's one movie which is very, very old that I've seen that was really, really frightening called Nosferatu.
Oh my gosh, that's a classic.
That's from like 1920 something.
Yeah, something like that.
And it's kind of a reimagining of the Count Dracula story. And it's a silent movie and it's black and white. But don't let that put you off. It's a super scary movie because just the way that they shoot it and it's,
that old man with the long fingernails is a very famous movie image. So yeah, vampires have been inspiring artists for a century, we could say, at least, and I'm sure will continue into the future.
Well, you guys can think about this question to talk about the vampires that you've seen in media or books. That's all we have for now. Mike and I are going to go down to the blood bank and see if they've got any leftovers. And maybe we'll see you tonight.
Checking for holes in my neck. I think I'm okay for now.
Vocabulary Review.
Creature. Billy didn't like the comic book because it had lots of scary creatures in it. Loosely. This movie very loosely follows the story of the book with the same name. In many ways, it's quite different though. Wooden. I think we should buy the wooden chairs rather than the plastic ones because they look more natural. Recently. I've recently been reading a book about the history of Australia. I bought the book last week. Sexy. Jason wants to watch this movie because he thinks the main actor is very sexy. He thinks she's the most beautiful actor he has ever seen. Frighten. Jimmy made a loud noise while his brother was sleeping to try to frighten him.
智慧 位小补帖。
Inspire. Villain. Entertain.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net